the 36 women, current and former women presidents and prime ministers, and the over 600 women who are ministers. But on behalf of the Council, I'd like to thank you for coming today to attend this wonderful talk with Claire Shipman and Katty Kay, co-authors of Womenomics. The event is co-hosted by the Council of Women World Leaders and the Alma and Joseph Gildenhorn book series. Is Alma here today? Not yet. Okay. Also like to welcome all of the many dignitaries here from the many embassies. If I start listing, I'm sure I'll hit some and miss others. So for that. Excuse me. Just turn the page here. This is part of, for the Council, the Madeleine K. Albright Women's Voices at the Aspen Institute series. Let me also now just thank the Aspen Institute staff, who's worked enormously hard and long on this program, Jim Spiegelman, and his team of people, Rachel Summer, Jeff Halter, Tarek Rizik, and Alina, pardon me if I spell your name wrong, Sastik Heron, if I said that wrong, Alina Dumatras from the Council of Women World Leaders, Britta Stevenson, and the interns who work with us. Today you're going to hear from two exceptionally powerful women and their women's voices. Womenomics is a book about women and for women and about women. And they basically encourage all women to write their own rules for success and to discover basically how to stop juggling and struggling and finally start living and working the way you want to work. Perhaps even more importantly, they present some very solid research that shows that companies who have the most women in senior management have higher returns on equity. And given that I'm a senior advisor to a small investment bank, Goldman Sachs, we're always pleased to hear those kinds of statistics.
So that's why they have good returns. I mean,
absolutely, Walter, that's it.
Cool.
The authors also show that women will have a tendency, perhaps, to manage differently in the workplace, that they may, in fact, have different risk profiles, that they might agree that we might not be in this crisis today if it had been Lehman Brothers and sisters in the process. You can comment on that if you want. They indicate that women are very valuable to organizations and help organizations understand how to encourage and get women to the highest levels of leadership. Let me now introduce Walter Isaacson. Walter was the chairman and CEO of CNN and the editor of Time magazine. He's the author, as many of you know, of some very famous literary works, including Einstein, His Life and Universe, Benjamin Franklin, An American Life. Walter began his career, I didn't know this, Walter, the Sunday Times of London.
Harry Evans, you remember him?
Yeah, oh my God. I say I do.
He was a new young editor.
Yeah. He joined Time magazine in 1978, and then he became the magazine's 14th editor. He became chairman and CEO of CNN in 2001, and then the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute in 2003. He's an enormous supporter of the Council of Women World Leaders, to which we thank him very much. And now I turn it over to you, Walter.
Laura, thank you so much, and thanks for all you do. Really appreciate it. One of the things the Aspen Institute has done for the past 65 years is look at the notion of how we balance things, especially balance our lives and our work, starting with Plato's concept of the good life. And in particular nowadays, that's an issue that arises in corporate America when it deals with balancing family, work, and especially as women become leaders in the workforce. This is something that's gone on for the past 30 or 40 years, but each new decade seems to bring a new way of looking at it. Claire Shipman is at ABC News, as you know. Della and Hugo, two wonderful children, so she balances it both. And Katty Kay, the anchor of the BBC News that we now can watch here, as well as American correspondent BBC. I think you have 4 children. So you're both...
4 and I'm done. That's
yeah,
it.
Okay. You're both experts in this balance. How did you all decide to write this book, and what did you learn when you did so?
Well, we decided to write the book because, based on our friendship and our own experiences, really, in the workplace, Katty and I had found we'd met each other as colleagues, and we would often compare notes about our careers, but they weren't the typical sorts of notes you would compare. We were giving each other really counterintuitive career advice about how to not be on air the next day and what jobs not to take, and how, really things that, for I think most women and men certainly, but this often pertains to women, are afraid to even discuss, how do we how do we make our work with our children? What are we feeling? A lack of ambition? Are we, ambivalence, trying to make it all work? And I guess we would have these discussions over the years, and we finally realized, look, maybe the fact that we have careers where we've turned down big promotions at times, but we still are in the workplace in jobs we like, and we have time to raise our kids. Maybe that is a kind of success, and maybe there's a pattern here.
Yeah, I mean, Claire and I would have these kind of whispered conversations, in corridors at events around Washington, and we felt like we were the only two people having these conversations. And then when we started doing the research for the book and thought maybe there was something more to this, we found that not only were most of the women we knew having similar conversations and similar dilemmas, but that there was an awful lot of power that women had in the marketplace that they just weren't aware of. And we came across a host of business researchers, now half a dozen studies showing that companies that employ more senior women make more money. And we started talking and thinking, well, how about if women could use that power that they have in the marketplace to get what all of our women friends and colleagues seem to be saying they really want, which is more time. Not necessarily the corner office straight away, not necessarily more responsibility, not necessarily more status, but actually to get more time. And we kind of came to this conclusion that time was really the currency that women, professional women, we were talking about, college-educated professional women, that was the currency we craved most at the moment. And so the book came out from our personal conversations, but actually then grew into much more of a sort of business trend book, looking at this new data that we uncovered.
How does the recession play into this?
Well, we were writing this in the middle of the recession, and so we weren't sure how it was going to play into it, actually. And a lot of people said, look, because we uncovered a lot of incredible data, not just about what Katty was talking about, the more senior level women you have at a company, the more money it makes, which it was astounding to us. But also the fact that many companies really are moving ahead with the idea of just almost full flexibility in the workplace, starting to measure results instead of time in an office chair, which really works well for women, because women are very results oriented and we are quite efficient. So we looked at, we were looking at all of these companies that had realized they were seeing much higher productivity when they were implementing this. And then people sort of say, oh, the recession, everybody's going to abandon the idea of flexibility and all of this sort of work-life balance stuff. That just sounds like a favor. Who can afford it? But what we found was that, in fact, because it was flexibility that was based on productivity and results, and it's not really a favor, companies were actually realizing that during a recession, this is a tool not only that might work for them, but in a lot of ways they actually had to use. So what we found is that the companies that were already headed down this path or sort of, embracing it even more and are not going to abandon it. And a lot of companies that weren't looking at this as a way to work or a way to negotiate with or work with their employees were kind of forced to do it because they, suddenly they don't have the wads of cash to give people bonuses, to give people raises. So they have to look at other things that matter to people. And the fact is time and flexibility and control over time really does matter to today's worker.
I do think that we have moved beyond a stage where companies are saying we want senior women just for diversity reasons or for PC reasons. 30 years into kind of women being in the professional sphere, it's now okay both to say women are different from men, that we have different priorities, that we measure differently, that we work differently, that we manage our teams differently, but also to say we actually need women for the bottom line. We don't need them just because it looks better if our office has a few more women in it. But I think that what companies are finding, and this is particularly true of retail, I mean, if you think about it, women now buy more cars in America than men. In 2007, we broke through that halfway mark. We actually buy more cars. We influence 83% of consumer spending in America. Companies want to sell to us, they are going to need people that we want to buy from. Who do we want to buy from? We want to buy from people that understand our needs. So companies are realizing they need to keep women, but at the same time they're seeing this professional brain drain. It really is happening at kind of, career levels, that women are saying, given those 70-hour weeks, 60-hour weeks, and that crunch between kids and career, we can't do it all. We're going to have to, and a lot of women have decided we're going to opt out altogether. So you have had, at a professional level, you have had an opt-out revolution. And companies have come to us since we've come out with the book saying, we want to hang on to women. And we don't want to hang on to women because we think it looks right or because it's politically correct. We want to hang on to women because we need them. Well, I think that then starts meaning that, well, if women are needed, the economy needs us and our companies needs us, but we need to work in a different way, you start having a marriage there that starts looking good for both sides, that women are starting to be able to say, well, okay, you need us, and we need to work differently. And actually, when we do work differently, we are remarkably productive. And I think that was the other side of the research that just we found so exciting, was when we came across these companies who have effectively taken the clocks off the walls and said, okay, you can work from 2 o'clock in the morning from Starbucks, you can work from 4 o'clock in the afternoon from home, you can work from 3 o'clock in the afternoon from the office. We really don't care where or when you work. We just care about the results, and we will measure those results carefully. Those companies find that retention levels go up, employee satisfaction goes up, productivity goes up, sometimes by as much as 40%. So I think you have a real change, Walter, in the workplace, at the moment being driven by women and their desire to be able to have time for their families. But actually, when you look at younger generations, it's being driven by women and
Well,
men.
and that's what's really interesting, is that, it seems our generation of women that are driving this now, but Gen Y, especially when you look at what they want out of the workplace, the men sound just like the women. I mean, the men don't want to, they value time with their family. They're looking at what the company does. Salary is not their top priority. There's, the young group of Stanford law students, mostly men, have started a rating system of law firms to see how family friendly they are, and they're not going to go to a law firm that, doesn't qualify. I mean, this is a really different group of young people, and I think that's what has companies looking at, keeping the women, the mid-level women, but then suddenly at the recruiting and realizing they've got to meet a completely different set of desires on the part now of this workforce, that money isn't enough.
You know my wife, Katty, and she was a lawyer at a Wall Street law firm in New York as an associate, as everybody's trying to make partner. And one Christmas time, a note went up on the board saying, this Thursday is Christmas Eve. If you plan to work past midnight, please sign here so we can have enough support staff for the number of lawyers who'll be working. And everybody in her associate's class had, of course, signed on the bulletin board that they'd be working past midnight. And Kathy said that's when she decided that there would never be a balance of working at a Wall Street firm. That firm subsequently imploded. And I do think it gets to what you're saying, is it's not just women, but that type of mentality that says you can't balance life and work doesn't work for anybody.
No, I think it used to be, we've spoken to people, to lawyers and to people that work in finance, who say, and I think there is a generational shift both downwards, but I think if Claire and I look at the generation of women above us who really did have to kind of do those 67-hour weeks and not talk about family and be much more like the guys. I think there's now a kind of recognition that you can say, I'm not sure that process of staying in the office till midnight and boasting about Saturday mornings in the office or Sundays in the office and how much I work, I think that's a reevaluation that's really happening, that I'm not sure people are saying that's something that's worth boasting about anymore. We talk in the book about a kind of linear knocking down ladders. I think that for many women of our generation, but for younger men and women, that idea of a straight career ladder is not something that appeals anymore, that more and more people are thinking that actually maybe if you see your career as a wave, that sometimes you dial it up and sometimes you dial it back again, that's actually much more feasible.
One of the things you say in the book is that requires an ability to say no. How does that work?
Well, it's true, and I think that you do have to be willing, and some people have said, but you're giving things up. There are sacrifices that you're making. And I guess it's all in what you define, success versus sacrifice. Because Katty and I have both said no to a number of opportunities, and they were probably the sorts of opportunities where you start to feel that you should be saying yes because they're either the next step in what everybody would say, you know, how your career should look. But
let me ask something really personal on that, which is probably prying too much.
That's
Good
okay,
Morning, Good Morning America is now open. Do you put your hat in the ring, or do you say no because it would destroy your family life?
To be honest, I could not imagine doing that job.
Okay.
I could imagine doing it if my kids were grown, but it is so brutal, and
So that's a case of this.
Right, and I
wave.
did, when I first started at ABC, I did a fair amount of filling in as the anchor, and so there were times when I would do it for a week at a time, and and thank goodness, because it really helped me to see what that was like, and I realized it's just, right now, I couldn't do it because I think I'd be giving up too much in terms of the time I have with my kids. And at the same time, I could see from ABC's point of view, I don't think they'd want to have somebody who had hesitation and, who didn't want to hop on a plane to go promote this gigantic enterprise they have that's Good Morning America. I mean, they need somebody in that job who's fully committed. And I guess that's why we say I think there are times when you might decide to say no, and carve out that time for yourself. But I think here's what's exciting. I literally think 10 years ago, if you were saying no to things, you would often find yourself on the mommy track to nowhere, and you say no, and that was it. Now, it really is possible, and not everywhere. We're not Pollyannas, but it's growing increasingly possible to say no for a while, move back in, stay connected. I mean, look at Brenda Barnes. I mean, she to me is the most inspirational example, the CEO of Sara Lee, who quit her job, the high-profile job she had as a top executive at PepsiCo, stayed home with her kids for 7 years. Everybody thought she was crazy, that
and actually,
she would
there was a lot
never
of
work again.
ambivalence about it. I mean, she was being told that she was not doing a favor to the women's movement, and that she was quitting somehow, and what were other women going to say?
Yeah.
And it was quite
what was
politically
she
a
saying
difficult thing that she did. And she was
What have you
given
learned
some
from the
flack for it.
CEOs? I mean, we have PepsiCo, Xerox, Sara Lee, quite a few corporations now with women CEOs. Is there a pattern?
I mean, quite a few, but not very, very
Quite a
many.
few.
Many
It's
of them,
a
it
lot.
has to be
Quite,
said,
think,
I
yeah.
find that the pattern there is most of them have stay-at-home husbands.
Yeah. I mean, that is quite often the pattern, isn't
and
it?
that's just a reality. And I think that's the other point is that if, not everybody's going to want to have a zigzag path and take time to be here, there. And I mean, some women and men are very much going to want to go straight for the top. And that's the way their life works. And thank goodness there are women like that. And I think women at the top make it easier for other women.
Let me open it up because there's so many. In fact, let me introduce Cindy Moelis, who is the head of the White House Fellows Program. And raise your hand if you're a White House Fellow. I assume a few of you have come. Yes. All right, you all get first priority on questions, too, if you want. Although I think you had your hand up. Yeah, go ahead. Just shout it out.
Hi,
All right.
Irina Tibidecker. I'm president of the Global Summit of Women. The business case for including women in senior ranks has been around for a long time, as you found in your research, but it hasn't resulted in great change for women. There are only 13 women CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies. Only 16% of senior executive positions are held by women. Where they are making headway is in entrepreneurship, in the mistaken notion that they can combine work and family by starting their own business. So having done your research, what is the way for making women's economic cloud, Womenomics, which Newsweek coined in 1998, what will make companies do more of what some companies are doing?
Well, I think, go ahead.
I mean, one thing that I think has changed since 1998 and is changing every month as we speak is technology. And that has changed the way we can work. So it is now possible to divorce yourself from the cubicle in a way it wasn't even possible in the mid-90s. And we can take our Blackberries home, pick our kids up from school, take an email from a client. And if you think, and I think this is what's happening particularly with Gen X and Gen Y, and I see it with my own teenagers, the idea for them, and I think a lot of this is about control over your schedule, and that's what a lot of women say would help them stay in the workforce. It's not necessarily having a part-time job. I think all of those notions of part-time and flexibility are starting to sound a bit old-fashioned. It's really about being able to have more control over your day, and that's what will keep women in the workforce. And you're not going to have women at the very top unless you keep them in the middle of the pipeline. So I think you look at Gen X and Gen Y and this technology factor is that for them the idea of having to be in a specific location from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening in order to be productive is anathema. And they are not, that is not how they would define productivity. They define their relationships virtually. They get their homework done virtually. So that generation are not going to tolerate the idea that they have to clock in at 8 and clock in out at 6 again in order to have fulfilled some sort of illusory productivity requirement. And I really think that technology has been a real friend to women in this respect, that it does allow us to keep our jobs and get in and out of the office and divorce ourselves from the cubicle.
And the other thing I would say is that I do think that there does seem to be a lot of focus right now, and a lot of people have talked about it, that while this data has been around, it's suddenly coming together, and I think it has to do with the recession and what happened. I think there's a lot of reevaluation going on now about business practices, what went wrong, how to do it better. And I've seen it at a lot of companies that we've talked with during our research for the book and then after, that really are looking at how can we do things better. They understand they want women at the top. They understand, beyond that, the data about women and the bottom line, there's this great bit of data out of the University of Michigan, and an economist there who has a math model called the diversity theorem, which he studied business making, corporate decision making, and has found that every time better corporate decisions are made when the group making them is diverse as opposed to homogeneous, no matter how smart, qualified, whatever the homogeneous group is. And I think there is a real recognition now that, and I know everybody in the room laughed a little bit about the Lehman sisters, but I really don't think the people looking at this are laughing. I mean, because people understand now, when you look at the funds managed by women, and there aren't that many of them, but they're there, they have a very smooth performance rate. The funds managed by men are like this. I mean, women and men manage in very different ways, and there's just no question that the combination makes sense. So, essentially, I think what Katty said is right, is that now the companies are focusing on how do we keep women in the pipeline? And that, to me, is the critical question, because you can't just suddenly scoop up a bunch of top women and throw them on boards. You have to keep them from leaving at that crunch level, and I think it's starting to happen. I think that the flexibility, the technology, I think women are going to find more options and want to walk away less often.
Yes. I'm Nina Gardner, and I've started 3 professional women's associations in Europe over the last few years, trying to get more advocacy on the women economics issue. One of my questions is just, I'm glad the data is coming together, and I think that makes a big difference. It's sort of depressing that if you look over history, that the times when the country needs you, like World War II was an incredibly important example, is when we tended to take women on board in industry and all the sort of jobs that we were shut out from. And you mentioned the recession. There's been some discussion as to whether, actually women are being retained more. This recession is hurting women less. Why? Because we tend to cost less.
Well, also because we're in industries that have been
And
less
we are
affected.
in
We're
healthcare and education, and not
in
construction or manufacturing and finance.
Right.
And so that's sort of a depressing thought, but I think that as we start understanding the power we have in terms of the purchasing power, as you said, and the power of retention, and if you look at the statistics on the talent pool coming out
Right.
in Europe, the Middle East, very important. And in this country, that the people coming out of higher education are predominantly women. So if they want to have good people, they're going to have to keep it. Last note, for those who haven't seen the September issue of the Harvard Business Review, I didn't write it so I can plug it, The Female Economy. It's a really extraordinary article that's worth reading on this topic by Michael Silverstein and Kate Sayre. So
That, and then there's an interesting article that came out in Foreign Policy during the summer called The Death of Macho, by Rihan Salam as well, which is looking at similar things, which is also interesting. But I mean, if you have various publications and various think tanks, and Claire and I have had conversations with the White House as well, policymakers looking at this issue of how women are a key part now of us coming out of recession. And of course, you're right. Is it perfect? By no means is it perfect. But I think that the trends are moving in the right direction for women.
Yes.
Deb Derrick of the Gates Foundation. Sorry. Does your book have anything looking at government? Because those of us who are working here in Washington, D.C., one of the things that's difficult to make the argument for might be that there's no profit orientation in government, so it might be slightly harder to prove productivity or sort of performance.
I mean, I think...
Hold on 1 second. Let me, those of you standing in the doorway there, we have about 6 or 7 seats up front. Why don't you all come on in and have a good time, or stay out there and eat the dessert before we
Yeah, exactly.
whichever is your preference. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
I suppose on government, there's a couple of things that come to mind. One, on the benchmarks for measuring productivity. We spoke mostly to businesses and we didn't speak to government, but it's very interesting when you watch how businesses do set up these benchmarks. They would say, business leaders would say that almost everything can be measured, that you actually can set targets. And I think, and we had a conversation recently with somebody from the Justice Department who was saying that she now has a scheme where that employees can take 1 day off a week. And actually, she says it's the only day that she knows they're being productive, because on that day they have to have benchmarks, because they have to be able to justify their day off at home. And so that's an example of where government is setting benchmarks. And the benchmarks when we looked at a company, for example, like Capital One, and we spoke to somebody from them who's a senior vice president down in Texas, and the benchmarks are incredibly specific about the targets that you have to meet. And she says you can either do it on a weekly basis, or if people are more senior, you do it on a monthly basis. But I think that, I do think that you can have benchmarks in government as well. It doesn't have to be a profit benchmark, because it can be whatever it is, the number of grant applications you filled in, whatever your relationship with whatever your particular area of expertise is. The other thing I'd say about government, and this gets back to the European issue, of course, is I had conversations with Harriet Harman, who's the deputy leader of the Labour Party in Britain, where they have introduced a law on flex time that has actually proved to be very successful, and companies are liking it, where they're mandating that companies have to give a very good reason for turning down an application for flex time. So they're trying to make it easier for people to ask, both men and women. And companies are finding, they've just had an interim report drawn up by Sainsbury's, one of our big retail supermarkets, that have found that it's been very successful. I think the difference here between Europe and America is that it's the moment you start talking about legislating flex time, people panic. So you have a very different system, and I think what you have to do here is stress the business case, and that's why we were so excited about the research we found from companies like Best Buy and Capital One and Sun Microsystems, who have found that when they do implement flex time and more flexible work arrangements, they found it very productive. That's a different point.
For government, I do think, because I know the White House has been very interested in this issue for the federal government and trying to figure out how to make it possible, but in a way, it should be a natural incentive. It would be a wonderful thing to start to try to implement this in a big way for government workers, because it would be an incredible perk. And I think it would be a wonderful reason to try to make the government more productive, more virtual, and more sensible in so many ways. And I don't think the benchmarks have to derive from a profit motive if you have good management.
I mean, some managers have said to us, well, it's this idea of benchmarks, that's a real pain, it's an extra job for us. But the companies that have done this have found that once you put the benchmarks in place, they're in place, and okay, it is a little bit more of work at the beginning to set up these alternative work schedules, and people have different requirements. But once you've done it, it works pretty smoothly within the system. The other point on government, of course, is that you have mayors in certain cities who have said, we would like it if people stayed home one day a week. I mean, the
doing it all over the
congestion
place.
issues, environmental issues in a whole host of ways, this makes sense in terms of policy.
How does the technology get us there? I mean, social networking has worked so well in a social context, and yet there aren't really corporate social networking being implemented to allow you to have virtual offices the way we thought was going to happen 10 years ago.
I think it is happening, actually.
Okay.
I do think that on the corporate and the social networking, Claire and I were at the Fortune Most Powerful Women Summit a couple of weeks ago, and Dell apparently has sold $3 million of refurbished computers over the summer on Twitter, which suggests that social networking is actually becoming more and more of a business tool. But I think in terms of virtual offices, I can do, bar being in the studio for the times that I need to be in the studio, I can certainly do all of my research. I can be emailing backwards and forwards with London in a nanosecond on my BlackBerry. I think that more and more, particularly in the professional realm, if you're on the line, this is different, but if in the professional realm, you can do more and more of what you need to do from anywhere. I mean, it really doesn't matter where you are.
Cindy.
Hi, I'm Cindy Molis. I'm with the White House Fellows Program. I was one of these women who took some time and worked 50 to 75% and then came back full time. And I think one of the challenges is until it's not just a women's issue, and you did refer to the fact that men do this now, it will always be somewhat marginalized, and it will be hard for women to come back in with the credibility, which is always a challenge. So do you see any sort of policies or anything happening that encourages us all to embrace this as opposed to just women?
Mm-hmm.
I think it is, we have talked about this, what Katty just mentioned with legislation. I think that's an uphill battle in this country, again, to try to legislate something like what they have in Britain and a lot of other countries, which is very helpful because it removes the stigma and it really encourages everybody to make use of it. I mean, to some extent, I think it's just a natural progression. I think that for the younger generation, I don't think it will be a stigma. I mean, and I see that, for example, at Sara Lee, they've created programs called returnships, where they try to bring people who've been out of the workforce, and they're almost all women, for a while back in and retrain them for a year and then move them into the company. I just think that it's, to some extent, it's going to happen naturally, and
I suppose we have an example of where it did happen as a women's movement and then became a company-wide thing, which was at Capital One, where the reason Capital One started implementing what they call, and every company calls these things slightly different. At Capital One, they call it their alternative work schedules. About 5 years ago, they surveyed their women's group because they were losing professional women in their late 30s, early 40s. Classic scenario, women with young children, they were losing them. And they wanted to find out what it would take to retain them. So they filled out a long questionnaire. They did a survey. Flexibility came back. More control over their schedules came back as the single biggest reason that women were leaving. So they started implementing flexible work schedules for the women's movement. And then they decided about 18 months later, they saw this was working very well. Retention was going up. The women were much happier. Productivity was going up. And so they surveyed the whole company. And they found that this wasn't a women's issue, that they'd been erroneous in thinking this was a women's issue. Actually, for men as well as women, more control over their schedules was the number one thing that would entice them to stay at the company for longer. So they then took it out of the women's network, made it a company-wide issue, and they don't care. It can be to walk your dog that you want a flexible work arrangement. They literally say it doesn't matter, because here's the big shift, when flexibility no longer is a favor but is a business strategy, that companies that implement alternative work programs find that it improves the bottom line. So why not give it to everybody? At that point, it doesn't matter what the reasons are or who's taking it, because actually your business is doing better because of it. And I think that's the transition we are on the edge of, where this is no longer something like candy at a kid's birthday party to be handed out. I'll give it to Anna because she performs well, but I'm not going to give it to Sarah, and I certainly won't give it to John because he's a man, God forbid. It's when you realize that both Sarah, Anna, and John will work better if they have more control over their schedules, will be more productive, you give it to everybody.
And I think a lot of people, I think that's right, that when you have a program that is open to everybody and it's transparent, that's when it works best. And when it's not just, a one-off negotiation for every employee.
With tears
and
in the corner office,
Right.
and oh my gosh, I haven't got enough. I mean, you need to avoid that. That's what
because
we hope you need to
in those
avoid.
cases, it usually is the women who are going to ask for it and probably get it, and it might be one or two women who are key performers. And Katty and I would hear a lot. Well, we can't, but what if Anna is not performing that well? We don't want to just open this program to everybody. And the fact is that is a red herring, because if Anna's not performing that well, it really doesn't have anything to do with flexibility or not.
You have a performance issue.
You need to work on that as a performance issue. So and Best Buy is another incredible example of that, where they have a results-only work environment. And it's the same thing. The management teams decide when and where they want to work. There's no vacation time, no holiday. People just get their missions done. They figure out where they're going to meet, and the men take advantage as well as the women, and they've seen productivity increase as much as 40%. So I think to some extent it's going to be the company leadership that embracing this that is going to take it well beyond me begging ABC. And probably my male colleagues at ABC feeling like, well, she gets that because she's a mom.
Having said that, the number one reason people don't get flexible work schedules, they don't ask for them. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is the number one reason. So if you don't have a company where this is company-wide policy, it is still very difficult. In fact, we were being interviewed by somebody recently whose producer kind of grabbed us aside in the corridor afterwards and said, it took me 1.5 years of therapy to ask my boss for 1 day off a week. And we said that must be the most expensive 4-day week in the history of the...
Let me push back a little on something. And it's sort of a hypothetical, but it could be real. You're saying there's no great conflict, because if you give this flexibility, it increases productivity. If you give it to everybody, it increases productivity. But suppose there were certain industries or types of firms where it did not increase productivity to give people more flexibility, but women, of course, who wanted to raise families needed it a little bit more, say, than men, just the way things work. Can you make the moral case that you should? It's so easy to make the case if economically it's good for the company, but what if it isn't good for a particular company? Are you still able to make a moral case that they should do it?
I think that more and more I also, this is the other point I was going to make in answer to that question, and it relates to yours, which is that I think we still have to recognize that as women, we may want different things than men want, and that we have to embrace that. I don't think we can have an expectation that, all right, I am going to work differently, but I should have all the same opportunities as my colleagues who aren't working differently. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that makes sense. So I think to some extent we have to recognize that in making different choices there are consequences, but we're going to live with that. And it may be that if we look at that industry, that maybe that doesn't make sense for me as a woman to be in that industry if it's not one that is going to allow flexibility. And there are going to be businesses. I mean, you're running factories. I mean, investment banking is a particularly hard one to crack, and we've had talk after talk about how could this work? But it's just one where you need to be there for your client around the clock, and if you're not going to do that, you're probably not going to be one of the big money makers. So that's something that is an individual decision, and I'm not so sure that. I think that what really makes things happen is a bottom line business decision. I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical that businesses are going to do things because it's the right thing to do. I don't think that's going to turn out well.
With that. I don't think.
So there will be industries that are harder to crack, whether it be fishermen or investment bankers.
But I mean, it is interesting that we've had, and you think of the production line. But it is interesting that we've had conversations. We had a 2-hour-long conference call with 100 American companies, one of which was Alcoa, which is really looking at this. And they want to give, because they've had problems on their production lines, and they've realized that even there, people are saying, we just need a bit more control. Now, all the shifts still have to be covered. So Alcoa was saying, well, you know what, maybe if we allow people on the production line to communicate amongst themselves more than have to come to management to change a shift, but we need all the shifts covered. But if I know I need next Thursday morning off for a series of doctor's appointments for my
Right.
kids, I can get somebody else to take my shift and I will take their shift. And even that, apparently, on production lines, even that amount of control is making people happier.
Let me ask if you make a distinction, or whether it's a false distinction between two different things. One would be white-collar women in the workforce versus those, say, on production lines. And related but somewhat separate, between women who work because they want to but don't absolutely have to, and women who work because they absolutely have to, or is that a false
No,
distinction?
of course there's a huge distinction. I mean, you know, if you are poor in New York City or you're poor in New Delhi, you have a lot fewer choices than people like Claire and I and most of the people in this room. And you know but that's true whether you are a woman or a man. If you are college educated and professional and wealthier, you have more choices. With wealth and education comes more choices. And that's true right across the board. What isn't, I think what is interesting is that the concerns of and the struggle for some sort of balance and to raise children and to have time are probably the same for mothers everywhere. I mean, whether they're in America or in England or in most countries around the world. It's just that the choices that you have to get more balance are greater if you have more
And that's
education.
why sometimes I think the you know, when we had a lot of women in our book say to us, it's not about wanting to work part-time. It really is about having more control over our time. So again, to some extent, and this can trickle down to so many different sorts of jobs that aren't necessarily professional jobs, you know, short of an assembly line, but where you are working at a set number of hours, let's say, but you have flexibility in terms of when you are working those hours. I mean, that can be invaluable to a mother. I mean, just
Right.
the ability to pick your child up from school once a week or attend a function or move your hours around and finish your work at home at night, it makes all the difference.
And this is, again, I think, where technology has been a real friend to this issue of control, because it is possible now. I do it. You know, I can leave my office at 3, pick my kids up from school, spend an hour or so with them, and pick up whatever I needed to do later on after dinner time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Judith.
Thank you. Judith Kipper, Katty and Claire, you're very cheerful and very optimistic, and I appreciate that, and I think that you've really stimulated a public policy debate that I hope becomes strong and fierce and effective. But aren't you talking a little bit under the radar at what's happening, because women and men, but particularly women, are struggling to find the balance you talk about? If we look at the things that make this country run, the financial institution, the car companies, the major industries. If we remember the days of the recession, there wasn't a single woman testifying in front of the Senate. The decision makers are still white males. They don't want to change. They don't see anything wrong. They're not even ready to change their responsibility and accountability for the billions of dollars they lost to the American public. So finding balance and doing real reform inside their corporations, and certainly there are many corporations that have done it, and it's working brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. But you both are public figures. How do you get their attention and make them understand that this is to their advantage and they're going to be more successful as multi-millionaires, billionaires?
Katty, Claire, yeah.
We write a book. And I mean, look, I think it's, in some ways, I went out to, you know, we focused a little bit on Walmart in the book, because there was a general counsel there. He's now the chief administrative officer of Walmart, but he was general counsel at the time, and I was hosting a panel with him and heard him talk a bit about how in the legal department he had started promoting diversity and sort of taken the legal department from basically 95% all white male legal department to now one that's, you know, more than 50% women and people of color, and then decided to use Walmart's clout to force that change to all of the law firms that Walmart hires, which is a huge chunk of business, and that had enormous consequences. And then started to, you know, go down the road of diversity and flexibility and work-life balance, and started to implement those changes. And I was just intrigued by looking at the amount of change a company like Walmart can affect, you know, because government can make some change, as we were talking about, but it's going to be hard to legislate. And when you look at the big companies, I think they're the ones that can make a big change. And I went out to talk to them recently since the book came out, and they are over the years have had real issues with lawsuits and women, and are now sort of trying to make this their next signature issue after going green, which is now getting women to the, and they're a retail business. So they know they need women. I mean, they really do have a problem. Their leadership is, all men. But they also know they've got to get women in the pipeline. And I really think there's no magic bullet that is suddenly going to change the array of people at the top unless we fix the middle. And I really think you got to figure out how women can, go through that crunch time and stay connected to the workforce and stay in it so that there are candidates at the top. There's not just one woman here and one woman there, but there are a whole host of candidates. But I really do think some places are listening. I mean, I really do think that they are not everywhere, and
I think that idea of people. I mean, I think we felt. I certainly felt sort of 10 years ago that change would only come from the top. That it would only be when there were more than the 16 female CEOs that we would have a change, and that they would then mandate change further down the line. But then I think to researching the book, it became evident that we were losing so many women in that critical period, and all the research shows that if you drop out altogether, it's very, very hard to get back in again. That you do have to stay connected to the workplace, and once you've taken that off-ramp, the on-ramp really basically has a big barrier across it, and you can't get back on again. So I think we were looking at how do you keep people from hitting that crunch wall, because without more women in the middle, we're not going to have enough women that can filter up to the top. And I think that's, of course, you're right, Judith, that when you look at the testimony on the Hill, it was all white men. When you look at Wall Street, but then the conversations are happening. You have research like this. You have the discussion about Lehman Brothers and sisters. You have the companies that we are talking to who are starting to see that there is a bottom line value in diversity, both gender and ethnic diversity and racial diversity. And I think the conversation is moving in that direction. I think it is a quantifiably different policy debate that is happening now than that was happening even 10 years ago.
You said something quite interesting, if I could put a point on it,
Walter.
was that if you get off somehow, as opposed to just keeping a toe in or, working 25%, if you get totally off, it's hard to get back on. There's no on-ramps again. And it would seem one of the great policy changes and one of the great things that organizations could do is start building on-ramps for people who did get off and who are now in their 40s or whatever, or 50s, and have raised kids. And the fact that there are no on-ramps for people who have taken time off, that would be a good roadblock
right,
to
and
remove.
If you look at Sara Lee, for example, they do have this on-ramp, this re-entry program. But if you think of how much has changed in your workplace, even here at the Aspen Institute, in the last 5 years, just partly because technology is changing things so fast. Somebody that has been out of that for 5 years, it's very difficult for them to they've got a heck of a lot to learn, not just about the business, but about the way the business is done, about the means of doing the business.
Yeah, almost as if there needs to be some re-entry sort of training and organization to make sure people can re-enter if they want.
Right, or ideally a way that women can stay, whether it's 50% or 75% or 100%, but stay in a way that means that they can raise families at the same time.
Sorry, over there, yes, and then here and here, yeah.
Hi, I'm Amy Wilkinson. I'm a fellow at Harvard and a scholar at the Wilson Center. I'm curious about the role of men in the world of Womenomics. And you mentioned a little bit the stay-at-home husbands of the CEOs. In '95, I was part of a Stanford sociology study that looked at gender characteristics of leadership, women and men. The big winners were men who adopted female characteristics, collaboration, horizontal structures. The big losers were women that did the same thing.
That adopted male characteristics, you mean?
No, it basically went men who did female characteristics, then men who did male characteristics, then women who did male characteristics, then women who did female characteristics were the big losers. So that study came out in 95. I went back to business school, and in 2002 out of Stanford, I thought it was the men who wanted to pick up their kids from ballet, drop up, that were really going to change this whole dynamic. The classmates that were men were making it different. So I'm curious the role of men in your research.
Well, we didn't focus that much in terms of the research on men. I do know that when we looked at the differences between men and women, it's the Families and Work Institute, which is part of the Sloan Foundation, which gave us a lot of their research, found that it is actually men, as you go from sort of mid-40s down to Gen Y, whose attitudes are changing even more dramatically than women in terms of wanting quality of life, saying they would value time with family over work, though they're changing more quickly than women. I think on a real number basis, it's still women who probably want that more than men, but the men's attitude is quickly shifting. And I just know that anecdotally we had on our book tour, it almost felt like every radio interview we did, we had men calling in saying, well, why are you only talking about women?
We want this too. Yeah.
We want to do the same thing.
We did an amazing survey actually with a group of were they first year college kids? I think
they were high school.
They were high school, and there was about 100 kids there, and we started off by asking them, all the women who thought that work-life balance was going to be important in their careers, to put their hands up, and I'd say 90% of the girls put their hands up. And then we said, okay, boys, if you think this is going to be important to you, can you put your hands up too? I'd say about 80% put their hands up. And it was there, and just when I was at university in England back in the 1980s, I didn't think about this at all. I mean, I had this idea that I was going to get to the top of whatever profession I chose, work 60 hours a week, have a fabulous husband, cook delicious meals, and slip in a couple of kids. And that was going to be having it all. And then I kind of had my first child, and I realized that wasn't having it all, it was just doing it all. And it wasn't actually very appealing. And I think the fact that you've got these young kids who are talking about this, who are talking that kind of language, and who are totally open about it, who say, absolutely, I definitely want to have interesting work, but I'm not sure that having the corner office or making partner by the age of 35 is actually what success means to me.
Phil.
I'm Phil Webster from the Aspen Y Fellows, and I have a question about your collaboration together on this book, but it's also a question about the difference between men and women. Walter has collaborated on a book in the past with other men. I've collaborated on magazine articles with other men. In my case, it was like two bulls clashing with one another. I wonder about the process the two of you followed in writing this book, and whether women working together as authors do it differently.
It's actually awkward for me and Katty to even sit next to each other now.
Yeah, we can't.
So much animosity. It was really ugly. We have said, and in fact, it was such a terrific collaboration that we don't feel we could ever write another book without the other one now. So I think that it worked wonderfully. We were just a cliche, really, about the way women work together, because we each wrote chapters, we would pass them back and forth, we'd edit them, nobody seemed to care, we just wanted to get the job done.
Maybe one thing that made it easy, there was no ego involved. And we just wanted to get this project done, and we wanted it to be good. But if Claire changed something of mine, or I changed something of Claire's, it didn't offend either of us. We didn't take it personally, and we didn't fight over, but you changed that sentence. And I think that was a real revelation to both of us, just how incredibly satisfying it was. And everybody said, it was a sort of metaphor for the way women work together. And
in the book you talk about collaborativeness being
and being able, I think, to take your ego out of things, because it wasn't right. Well, I feel my views have to predominate over your views on this, Claire. Chapter 1 will be the way I want it to be. It's my chapter. I don't think either of us ever thought that for a moment. In fact, somebody had said to us, because we were doing the book proposal around the Iowa and New Hampshire caucuses, and a friend of mine who had collaborated on a book with somebody said, "You are absolutely insane. You're thinking of writing, you have 4 children, you've got a full-time job, you're thinking of writing a book in an election year with somebody else, you will never talk to her again." And actually, we're much better friends now than we were when we started.
Yeah, it worked out well. But I do think it is interesting about the women and collaboration and conciliation, and why as you were talking about, that those tend to be more, feminine management qualities that I think for a long time, for so many years, we didn't even want to admit that there were distinct feminine, female management. We had to be just the same or it was wrong. And now I think there's a real sense that, especially internationally and given the global economy, that the way women manage is very hot. And that is the way that we need to be working now.
And nobody's saying that they want it to be Lehman sisters. It's the combination, and that's what the winning business formula is. It's the combination of women, Lehman brothers and sisters. If you look at something like Norway, for example, they have mandated 40% women on boards in public and private companies. Now, okay, I know it's a cliche to cite the Norwegians and the Scandinavians on this, but they've done it actually for solid business reasons that it works.
I was just laughing because on one of the first interviews we did during our book tour was with Charlie Rose. And he could not get over the fact that when we were saying, women tend to be more collaborative, more conciliators, he kept taking it personally. Remember, he's like, but men can do that too. It's like, Charlie, it's not about you, really. We know. Yes, men can be nice too. It is true, but
I'm not going to go there.
Hi, ladies. Thank you very much for writing the book. My name is Tiffany Moore, and one of the things I did appreciate about the book is that you didn't focus just on mothers. You didn't focus on about just women with children, but also women overall who value their time, and like you said, who may just want to go walk their dogs. I wanted to see if you could just kind of elaborate on that a little bit and just the value, and then you had also talked about how men in Generation Y, they also have a greater appreciation of time.
Yeah, obviously that was our own, I think, for a lot of women, it is when they have kids that they come up against this crunch. But what we found was that when you look at the data and, the women we interviewed, you don't have to have kids to feel this way. It's, at least our generation of women,
Talk about the lawyer.
Right. Well, and the research shows that women just value having connections more to their community, to their friends. We don't tend to be as linearly focused on a career. We take our ego and personal satisfaction from a lot of other inputs. And in a lot of cases, it's kids, but it's taking care of your parents, it's your friends. And we interviewed a lawyer who is just turning 40, I think, and she works for a top law firm in New York, who decided, a brilliant woman, suddenly decided she wanted a part-time partnership, wasn't married, didn't have kids, went into her senior partners.
Just needed a life.
They thought she was crazy. It's like, but you don't have kids, what are you talking about? And it's still, she's so glad she did it. She just wanted a life. It buys her basically, if she's lucky, 1 day a week, the way these things work at a very big salary cut. But she was still so worried about even talking to us for the book, we had to change her name.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, right there. And I didn't mean to take the microphone from you, so pass it back up to her when you finish. Yeah.
Stephanie Fouch with the British Embassy. I want to go back to the question and answer before about the Gen Y men and how they are embracing more of a desire for a work-life balance. Do you think this is because so many of them grew up in families where their mothers were working as well as their fathers?
I really do think that's a big difference. We've actually been talking about what to do next, and kind of men of our generation, I think, are a sort of fascinating study because they're almost an in-between generation. That they grew up, and certainly my husband, his mother never worked. My children will grow up with having had a mother who always worked. My mother always worked, and I think that makes a big difference on your attitudes to work. But I do think that you have a very interesting generational shift from this generation of 20, 25-year-olds who many of whom have seen their mothers work, but not just seen their mothers work, but have seen their fathers starting to be more involved in the process of child rearing and have seen the satisfaction that their dads have taken that, who have had closer relationships with their dads because of it, and who actually now think that they want to be able to have time to do that as well. And so for them, it's not an anomaly, it's not strange. And I think that's when you start getting big changes, is when it's no longer an isolated case. And I think, when my mother worked, she was sort of unique amongst, I don't think any of my friends' mothers worked full time. But I think that, for my kids, most of their mothers work and most of their dads have changed diapers and, picked up from ballet class and, taken the kids to whatever the games are. And that's a big shift. And so they've grown up with that in a way that is not abnormal, it's normal. And I think that then changes their attitudes to what they want from their relationship with their own children.
Well, and I think that there is a sense when you talk to young women, Katty talked about this earlier, that so many more young people, when we have them as interns at ABC or just people we meet around town, are stand up and ask these questions. I mean, one of the first questions they seem to ask are, how do you balance your life? How do you make it work with your kids? I mean, I couldn't even imagine asking questions like that when I was
for women who are older than us, it was totally taboo.
Right.
You just couldn't ask that
So
kind of question.
I think
when
that
you
the
were
young
starting out.
women look around and really place a great value on I think really it's true on figuring out how to do it better to some extent than the generation before. But also I think it's just that it's a subject you can discuss more. It isn't taboo, and I think it's very healthy. I mean, I hope it's not a complete reaction, against what they've seen. But I think to some extent maybe they've sensed the frenetic struggle and are trying to figure out how to take some of the stress out of all of it.
Thank you. My name is Fungi, and I actually have a question. Just looking and hearing about just looking at the numbers and acknowledging the fact that we have a lot more women in healthcare and education, and those are jobs where you don't necessarily, how do you talk about flexibility when you have to be either a nurse or a pharmacist, or you have to be a teacher and you have to be there from 8 to 10? And the only flexibility you can get is if you get a day off, but you're paid hourly. Whether you like it or not, you're paid hourly. You can be paid greatly hourly. You're still college educated, but how do you still get that flexibility? You're still getting less than your male counterparts are getting salary-wise. And how do you, I guess my question is, in those kind of environments, I think that's where the majority of the women are. How do we talk about these womenomics sort of issues? How do we introduce those kind of issues into those workplaces? Because I think once you get that cohort of women, which is the majority of the women, I believe, then it's so much easier then to see those numbers start increasing on a higher level in the corporate levels, in the, in government even, because then you've dealt with the issue with where the greater amount of people are, and then it's trickling up, and then you've got more people going up, and then you don't have 16 anymore. Suddenly you have 100 women that are leading.
Well, I certainly think education is something we could discuss for days, because I think that's trying to value the work of teachers and having a better pay structure is critical and needs to be debated probably at an entirely different level, because I think there is, and part of I've had so many people argue to us as we've been traveling around talking that part of the problem with public education now is that it used to be that was the only career opportunity really open to women. So the best and the brightest were in education, and now they're not. And so that's part of the problem we have today. But I certainly think trying to put place a better value as a society and better salary, because teaching really could be the sort of job that could work well for women with kids. I mean, it does to some extent mirror your own desires and schedule to be with your children, and I think that's what would tend to be appealing about it. But you're right, the pay and the status are not good, but I think in the larger question about professions where you really just have to be someplace and it's a certain number of hours. The main thing that we have seen is the ability to offer flexibility in terms of scheduling, and say, look, try to fix it so that employees have some control over the shifts they're working, when they can be off, when they can be on, so that you are treated more like an adult and you have more power over your decision making.
I'm thinking particularly about nursing, because there is an example in the book actually, and I think it's in Utah, of a big hospital that has actually tried to do this with its nurses, and because it was losing nurses, it faced a retention issue, and so it did actually. And I wish I should be able to remember the specific example, but I can't remember exactly what it was they did, but they did introduce a flexible element into their shift patterns for the nurses, and their retention levels increased dramatically. And so I think you'll have to find the example from the book, but there are examples, and again, it gets back to the control line, the production line. People have to be there. That production line at Alcoa has to be staffed. But even there, they are looking at ways where they can devolve sort of trickle-down effect of the control and try to give people
Right back there, and then
a bit
get
more.
Rima.
Hi, my name is Mary Schnack. I do communication training of women entrepreneurs around the world. And around the world, they're asking more and more for us to talk about life balance, whereas that was the big issue asked about here 10, 15 years ago. Now they're asking. And because I think words matter, I dropped the word balance. I think it's now integration. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's balance anymore at all. And I think that's why the flex time works, is because if we're passionate about what we do and we like our jobs, we're willing to integrate our lives together. So we stop, pick up the kids, make dinner, and then we're willing to go back. Whereas if you don't like your job, that's going to be much harder to do, and balance in that sense doesn't work. So I really use the word integration, and I just see the light bulbs go on for them.
Right.
That difference in words really makes a difference.
I think you're right. Work-life balance, we've talked about this a lot too. It sends corporate executives screaming. I mean, it sounds nutty, crunchy, and nobody, what does that
envisage
mean?
mums in tears, and it's kind of disastrous.
People lighting
we talk about
candles.
control, but I think integration is another word that we've heard that makes more sense.
Oh, that's interesting.
Rima Al-Sabah, who is a great exemplar both in Washington and in the Gulf world of the world of women. So.
Thank you. I was just curious, through your research, did you find that when women reach the post of CEO, are they more receptive towards giving flexibility to their employees, mainly female, male and female, or would men be more receptive?
It's a very, we keep getting asked this question, Rima, about whether, basically, whether women are better or worse managers than men, because everybody has the nightmare story of saying, well, I worked for a woman, actually she was much tougher than a man was. I have to say, we haven't come across any evidence that, and it would be an interesting business study, whether women are more or less receptive. I mean, our experience has been from talking to lots of women, you've got great women managers, you've got great men managers, and you've got terrible women managers and terrible men managers. But I haven't come across any evidence that suggests that women are actually, in numbers-wise, worse than men when it comes to the idea of flexibility.
Wait, hold on. Let Claire, and then we'll, bring it to you,
Because I have...
All right, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, can I just...
Yeah.
You went to 100, to the Most Powerful Women Conference, right? And over there you have all the
CEOs, the female CEOs. Have you talked to them? Have you seen how... I remember when I went eBay, the CEO of eBay was there.
Right.
Yeah. Are they trying to be flexible with their employees? Are they trying to,
it depends on
retain the female?
It depends on the company. Yeah. I mean, Brenda Barnes is obviously the CEO of Sara Lee, focused on this and is willing to speak out about it and talk about it. There are other top women. Sometimes it's not the CEO, but for example, the COO of McDonald's, heavily focused on this issue. She's a woman, and I think it often depends on the industry. Whether that's something that makes more financial sense right at that moment for the company, but.
We interviewed Meg Whitman for the book from eBay just after she'd left eBay and when she was working on the McCain campaign, and her take was quite interesting. Where she said, "I'm not particularly focused on this from a women's retention issue, but I'm very focused on this from a Gen X and Gen Y issue."
Yes,
she
Matt,
felt that flexibility was
you
important
wanted
for
to
them.
comment too?
Yeah. I chair Corporate Women Directors International, which does research on women on corporate boards. We looked at the 13 women CEOs in the US, and we looked at women CEOs in Canada. And what we found is that the percentage of women in senior executive positions were higher in the companies headed by women than the average. And they also had more women on the boards of their companies than the average percentage of women directors in male-driven companies, which sort of blew the notion that women don't bring other women along.
Yeah,
it was the exact opposite.
We didn't. Lots of women have said to us, "Oh, but women can be tougher managers than men." It's not actually been my experience. It's not.
Right back there. Yes, please.
I just was hoping
Could
we
you
could
introduce yourself, sorry?
I'm Tony Green.
Yeah.
Hey, I was just wondering if we could go back to your idea, Walter, about the on-ramp, because I think that kind of continuity is important, and perhaps with all due respect, it was dismissed too quickly. So perhaps before the on-ramp, there's like the cell phone parking lot, and that person, that person who is interested in possibly coming back, maybe because they have a baby, is parked in that lot, is with the company through technology, is part of the listservs and can have access to the websites and is part of meetings. And then it could be used for other things because there are other people who have to go into the reserves and things of that sort. So I think there are some ways that you could create that continuity.
I think one thing that is happening at the moment, and that's particular to this economic environment as well, and we've spoken to a couple of companies who have said that they have tapped into women who have been out of the labour force as a form of contract, but professional contract workers at the moment. So they are bringing in, and actually then some of them have then brought them on full time. So these were women who were finding it difficult to get back in again, but because companies perhaps have a freezing hire or a hire freeze and they can't promote people, so they're looking for ways to bring in talent, but they can't actually employ somebody full time, they are finding that women, mothers particularly who've been out of the workforce for a while, are a very useful pool to tap into of talent.
And when we talked to Marriott, they were very, they really are keen on trying to, keep their star employees or people who they value but who want to take time off connected. And they have a lot of ways that they're working to do that now, whether it's one small project a year, and I think there is a sense, because when you look at the cost of replacing talent, it is huge. And I think, again, companies are finally starting to realize this is, it costs us at the time to lose women. We're losing this valuable resource that, in fact, is unique and different than men. I think there are for a whole host of reasons. And then when we talked to some CEOs, they said this is, given what we've seen in the economy now, it would be ideal to have a system where you are able to, it helps employees to dial up and dial down, and it helps us. Because if you can have a workforce that has a little bit of ability to expand and contract, based on employee desires and economic times, that's going to make sense for everybody. So, but I haven't seen great programs yet, but I think people seem to be focusing on it in a piecemeal way.
Well, one of the great ways to promote flex time and flexibility is the writing of books. And it's also the best way to convey ideas. And so I want to say that this is a wonderful book, and it's on for sale. It's on sale out there, and they will both sign it for you. And we thank Politics of Prose, and we thank all of you all for coming. And please buy the book and stay to chat. Great. Wonderful.
Thank you, Walter.
Good job. Great job. Perfect.